Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always, your narrator through the next 30 minutes of all things HR on the Offensive. But today, we've got a slightly different angle. Today, we are going to be talking to one of the organisations that we support from a corporate social responsibility perspective and a charity that Laces have been getting behind. As always, when we run these podcasts, I have a partner in crime, a co-host, if you will, and today's co-host making your debut, I think, Nats, right? Yeah. It's Natalie Berkoff. Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm all right. Now, Nats, I got you on because to co-host with me because you're part of our CSR team. Can you just actually, before we introduce our guest, can you just do maybe just 1 minute on some of the things that the CSR team get up to, just for those people listening in who maybe aren't aware of some of the activities that we do at Lace Partners?
Yeah, of course. So I'm the charity lead for the UK charity for triple negative breast cancer. And so that means that me and 7 others are on a team and we organise fundraising events throughout the year and liaise with the charity and also spread awareness about what the charity does and the amazing work that they do and how to get involved throughout the company. So we've organised lots of different events already this year. We've done bake sales, we did a 10-mile walk throughout London, and we've got some more things upcoming throughout the rest of the year as well. And then there's 2 other charities that we support at Lace as well, and they also put on other fundraising events throughout the year as well.
Cool. So what we are going to do is we are going to bring in our guest, who is Robin Woolcock, who is the chairman at the UK Charity for Triple Negative Breast Cancer, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the background behind the organisation and some of the work they do. We'll get into our fundamentally different question as well. But let's first say hello to Robin. Robin, how are you doing? You all right?
Yes, I'm fine. I'm really looking forward to your fundamentally different question, of course.
For those of you that don't know, and maybe this is the first time you're tuning in to listen to the podcast, the fundamentally different question is a completely random and non-HR related, or in this instance, CSR related question that we use as just a little bit of fun to start us off, to kick us off, to a little bit of an icebreaker, if you like. What Natalie was talking about just before we go through to the fundamentally different question around our CSR activities. So we do a lot of activities to raise funds, but actually the reason why we wanted to do this podcast today is because it's if you're going to commit to supporting these organisations, I and we at the team of Lace believe that it's not just about raising money for businesses, it's actually also about raising awareness too. And that's why we wanted to run this podcast today. I'm going to hit you two with the fundamentally different question before we talk about the actual awareness part and finding out a little bit around the UK Charity for Triple Negative Breast Cancer. I have just read an article, which is an interesting article because last week there was apparently a Golden Surfy Award. For those of you who are not in the know, there was a World Dog Surfing Championship here in the UK. 20 dogs took part, putting dogs on surfboards, trying to get them to see if they can survive the onslaught of the British seaside. I cannot tell you who won because I haven't got that far, but my question, I'm going to start with Nats because let's give Robin a few seconds come up with his answer. But Nats, if you could pick one championship that you'd like to see 20 dogs get involved with, what would it be? And I'll give you mine to stimulate some conversation, and that would be a World Car Chasing Championship. But what are you thinking, Nats?
That's a really good question. I've had a complete mind blank of every activity that I've ever experienced in my life. Maybe something to do with tennis, so like ball collecting, because I feel
love
like
that.
dogs are really good at that. So getting them involved in Wimbledon on the courts as the ball boys or something.
Do you know
like that.
what? That is brilliant. I love the idea of the carnage as Novak Djokovic or Yannick Sinner are running around trying to collect these balls from these dogs. It would actually certainly add a little bit of humour to what is an elite sporting competition. Robin, what are you going for?
My answer, and believe it or not, I came up with something in my mind very similar to Natalie's. We have a dog in our family, a Springer Spaniel. I don't know if you know what Springer Spaniels look like, but they are the most energetic dogs you can imagine. They're called Springers for a good reason. But she is phenomenal at catching stuff. So actually, she would make a brilliant ball boy at Wimbledon. But I think there should be a world championship for Springer Spaniels for catching stuff. She'll catch balls, sticks, stones, anything that you throw in the air, and rarely misses. And when you think how small that target is to get it into her mouth, it's quite astonishing. A real superpower for English Springer Spaniels.
I love that. And I love that we are expanding this format to certain breeds as well. We've got ourselves the making of quite an Olympics, quite a dog Olympics there. But let's change gears slightly. And Robin, obviously, we wanted to get you on to talk about your kind of journey and your story. And so I think that's probably a good place to start. So can you talk to us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved, and maybe a little bit about the charity itself?
Can I start by talking a little bit about triple negative breast cancer? Because I imagine most of your audience are sitting there thinking, what on earth is that? Because like me and 99% of the public out there, you probably don't know what it is. And like me, thought all breast cancers are the same. And to discover that they're not came as a huge shock to me. And to discover that not only aren't they the same, but because they're not the same, the treatments are very different. And some are highly effective on certain cancers, and some breast cancers, and some are not. TNBC, unfortunately, it's called triple negative because it is negative for most of the drugs that are available around breast cancer. I'm sure most people know survivorship for breast cancer generally, the most common form of cancer among women, has improved immeasurably over the last 20 years. And that's because scientists have been able to discover what exactly are the chemicals that cause these tumours, and therefore what chemicals and drugs can you use to counteract them. Sadly, they don't work on these particular tumours that we're talking about. So this horrible long name, triple negative breast cancer, arose for exactly that reason. It's sometimes called the most aggressive. That's what you'll often hear people in the media call it. Because there are fewer treatments, unfortunately, the outcomes are not great. About 15% of all breast cancers are triple negative. Anecdotally, 40% or more of all deaths. So for the women, and it is massively skewed towards the female population, TNBC is not great. And the more I found out about it, the more I thought, these people really need some special attention. They need some special care. They're really not getting a great deal here. And so I set up a charity, really not knowing what we were going to do, but just with the general idea of there's got to be something I can do to make life a little bit easier for these people. And that's what I did about 3 or 4 years ago. It's totally taken over my life. You might say it's become an obsession, but it's worth it when somebody phones you up or sends you an email and says, thank you very much for what you're doing. For people who are often basically at the lowest point they'll probably ever be in their lives, with huge stress around their personal life and all the complications of going through a very difficult treatment pathway with lots of side effects. If we can help them a little bit, it's doing something really worthwhile.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, so how you got into...
Like most of these things, Natalie, they come from a sort of personal involvement, don't they? And my wife was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer in 2009. Gosh, an awful long time ago. And she died in 2017. And at that point, it was really the point where I said, I've got to try and do something about this. The difficulty then is what? It's very easy to say, much more difficult to do. So my personal journey then was, I knew nothing about breast cancer. I failed O-level biology. There's nobody less scientific and aware of how our body works and DNA and all the things that I've had to learn about than I was. I went on a huge journey. I was then very lucky that I met some people who have become really important, without whom I couldn't have done what I've done. I met an oncologist, a gentleman called Professor Chris Twelves. He is an expert in TNBC. He's a researcher. He discovered many of the treatments that there are available. And I went to him and said, will you help me? And he immediately said, yes, I will. And he is still our medical and scientific advisor. I met an amazing team of people in the US called the TNBC Foundation. I think you found them, Nat, on the internet. They've been going a little bit longer than I have, but they're the only other specialist TNBC charity group that I know about. And they really gave me a huge amount of encouragement to say, yeah, Robin, do it. It's really important. And unless you focus on TNBC, we won't be able to make the difference that we really need to make. And finally, I found a marketing team who the answer to every question I ask them is yes, when would you like it? And that has made a huge difference, because it doesn't matter what I do. If people don't know about it, then it's really not going to make very much difference to their lives. So creating and gaining awareness has been a huge part of what we have been doing now for the last 2 or 3 years. And we're really starting to make some traction, which is fantastic.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you do?
I think the first thing that I discovered was that you have to talk to the patients themselves. You can't assume you know what somebody with a cancer, with a triple negative breast cancer diagnosis, is what's important to them. So the first thing we did was go out and talk to many of these ladies, and they told us in no uncertain terms exactly what their issues were. And I'll never forget one or two of the first roundtables that we ran, where they said that nobody talks for us. We're invisible. Nobody understands what TNBC is, and nobody is representing us. And at that point, it became very clear that one of the very simple things we should do is set ourselves up as the voice of the patient, of triple negative patients. They then said, where can I go for reliable information? I can see loads of stuff on the internet, but I really don't know what's right, what's not right, what's for me, what is not for me. So setting up a website was absolutely basic, and the first thing that we did to provide reliable but understandable information, so that when people get that diagnosis, when the doctor sits there and says, I'm sorry to say you have triple negative breast cancer, and they walk out of the room and thinking, what the heck is that? That they can actually Google it. They will find us. We're up there on the top of the Google searches, and they will find information that explains to them in plain English what the situation is and what life for them is going to be like. And more importantly, that it can be cured, because the medics never tell you that. They don't want to give you false hope, but there are treatments and it can be cured. So giving people hope is really important. They then said, where do I meet other people like me? Because I've met lots of people with breast cancer, but I can't find people that have got triple negative. And I don't want to talk to them because I know their treatments are different. I know what they're going through, and their side effects are different. So we set up communities, we set up forums, we set up social media to ensure that people could talk to each other and support each other, and actually realize they're not alone. There's a lot of people out there that are going through the same thing that they are. And just being able to share those experiences is hugely therapeutic for them. And the last thing we discovered really was the importance of the breast cancer nurses. My respect for nurses has gone up enormously since I've been doing this, because it's a really tough job that they do, an extremely stressful one. But what the patients told us over and over again was having a nurse that I can talk to, that understands what my situation, that speaks to me openly and when I need them to, is a massive help to help me to cope with the treatment and hopefully get some good outcomes as a result of that. So one of the things we do is we do education for nurses. It's really simple. The NHS really doesn't have budgets to teach people. As one nurse once said to me, I think they think we learn by osmosis, and it just appears in our brains. So we do courses on triple negative breast cancer, and we have a champions program where we try to get at least one person with a special interest and knowledge around TNBC in every breast care unit in the UK. So that's what we're doing, and we've been doing it now for 2 or 3 years. Hopefully we're starting to make an impact, and certainly that's the feedback that we're starting to get from people with a TNBC diagnosis.
It's lovely to hear that there's a community coming together, because obviously it's a very isolating thing to be told this thing that you're going through is going through from yourself. And so it's really good that you've got that. And I think the education piece, particularly for the nurses, that's interesting as well. And it gets me thinking about our community that we have, that we work with at Lace Partners. Obviously, we are HR people function focused, and people that listen into this podcast will be working in HR teams and payroll teams across the land. What things can HR teams be doing as the function that looks after the people within the business? Any sort of thoughts that you could give people, or bits of advice listening in on how they can help raise awareness? Is there an education piece that HR teams can be doing amongst their businesses to try and raise the awareness of this? And what might that look like?
If we talk about cancers generally, what is the statistics? 1 in 3 people will have a diagnosis of cancer. So in every HR team, look at what your head count is, and imagine that 1/3 of those people are going to have a cancer diagnosis. And I wonder how many organizations actually have a cancer policy. I didn't have one in the companies that I worked in, and I now wish that I had, because every week, every month, somebody's going to walk into an office and say, I've got a diagnosis of cancer. And how the company responds to that is really important. So I think some basic knowledge of cancer, what it is, what impact it is going to have on somebody's life, and what impact it's going to have on their working life is really important, because it will have an impact on their working life. And I think then deciding what your organization is going to do about that is really important. I suspect many organizations stick their head in the sands and say, okay, we'll get through it somehow, it'll be all right. But actually, that's not good for the organization, because it's not proactive, it's not really putting in place things that may need to be put in place, and it's certainly not good for the employee. If you think about their situation, they've just been told that they have a potentially fatal disease. They have got now to work out what that means for their lives. How do they tell their family? What does it mean for their income? What does it mean? Will I have a job when I've been through this awful experience? And giving them reassurance is really important, and will help them to overcome the treatment, which is not kind, it's difficult to go through, and hopefully as a result end up with better outcomes. And that employee will be hugely grateful for you for the rest of their lives, and with loyalty and all the things that go with it. I think it's really important that some understanding of cancer is important. Simple things like, you don't die of primary cancer. Nobody dies from having a lump in their breast. What the problem becomes when the cancer spreads from outside the primary zone, and that's called secondary metastatic. You'll have heard all kinds of different words for that. And that then spreads, and it spreads to the brain, it spreads to the kidneys, it spreads to lungs, and these are critical organs. And when it does that, it's no longer curable, it is treatable, and life can be extended, but life will come to an end at some point. The drugs that don't last forever, the body gets used to those drugs, and then the outcome. So when somebody comes in and says, I've got a diagnosis, but it's primary, my oncologist tells me there's a course of treatment and there's a good chance of me recovering, that I think is really important, that the employee now, the manager or the company understands, okay, fine, let's handle that in one way. But if somebody comes in and says, actually, I've got probably 18 months to live, that's a very different scenario. And understanding the position that they are in and how you as an organization want to react is really important.
I think you picked out a couple of bits there which are quite essential, really. If I think about HR, so one of the things that we often say, we've written pieces about, is this idea that HR is it cannot be all things for all people, in terms of sometimes it's a centralized function, and you might have tens of thousands of people working within a business, and you can't just rely on HR for everything. Sometimes when you're thinking about building culture, or when you're thinking about an employee experience, quite often the experience that you get as an employee happens in your shop or in your warehouse, wherever you are. And so you'll have different kind of factions of culture or experience. And that then often comes down to the line manager as well. So it's the same with that empathy approach, isn't it? And so do you agree with this view that I'm putting across, that HR has a role to play to raise awareness amongst the whole business, but actually also it has a role to play to support line managers to be able to have those difficult questions, right? And to be able to build that kind of empathy and to give that support and be that support base for those line managers. Because quite often it's not all just going to be pushed through a centralized HR function, this type of conversation. That has to happen at that line manager level as well.
Oh, absolutely. And the employee who's had the cancer diagnosis needs to know what the view of their manager is. How is my manager going to view me? How are they going to treat me? What's going to happen to my job during this time? These aren't questions for HR. These are operational questions. Will they just do without me for a while, or will they want to bring in somebody to do part of my job? How are they going to handle that is really important. Or are they just going to ignore it and hope that the problem goes away, which is the worst possible reaction? So no, you're right. HR's role is to decide the policy, hopefully to organise some sort of online training so that people have an awareness of what do I say when somebody comes into me and says, I've got cancer, and how do I handle that, and what's the company's view on that? But that's got to be handled at an operational level. And the relationship between the employee and their manager has got to be retained through this whole process.
So you spoke about how the UK charity for TNBC is a new charity and quite a small charity. So why do you think it's so important for companies to support smaller charities? And what is the impact of supporting a small charity like the UK charity for TNBC?
The UK has some wonderful charities. We have some huge charities like Breast Cancer Now, Cancer Research UK, Macmillan. And the more you look at other countries, actually, they don't have them. Very blessed to have those organisations, and they do great work. But what they can't do is deliver stuff on a local level or specialities like TNBC. So smaller charities need to exist and have to exist. But we can't afford to go on TV and advertise and say, please leave us a legacy in your will. We're really dependent on organisations like yours and private individuals in providing us with donations. But the good news is that we make a little go a long way. A small amount of money to charities like mine makes a huge difference to Cancer Research UK, who spend £500 million every year. You're probably going to make any impact. But to organisations like ours, they make a huge impact. I think from a HR point of view, I think the employees get far more out of having a relationship with a small charity like ours, or a relationship with a local charity, a local hospice where maybe a valued colleague has died. It doesn't have to be TNBC. I'd like it to be, of course, but there are many, many other worthwhile causes. And there will be small charities, local charities or specialist charities near you who will be hugely grateful, give you a lot of support, and make the staff feel as if they're doing something really worthwhile and having an impact.
Yeah, we are unfortunately out of time, which is annoying, but because this is a really interesting, and I think it's a really important conversation as well in driving this awareness. We talked about it right at the beginning of the podcast. For us, it's not just about the charity raising, it's about the awareness raising too. So with the fact that we've probably only got about another minute or two left, Robin, is there any kind of final thoughts you want to leave our listeners in? I mean, obviously what we'll do in the show notes is we'll put a link to the TNBC website and where they can find you and things like that. But any kind of final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with before we disappear today?
I think if HR teams take the lead in thinking about charities and what role they can play in any organisation, the role they can play in team building and getting the organisation to feel better about itself, and a huge amount of fun, as I'm sure Natalie will admit, that you can have in doing something really worthwhile, but at the same time building teams and feeling like this is a worthwhile company for me to be employed by.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And a lovely send-off for the end of today's pod. We've just hit time at the moment. But Robin, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your story, and also the good work that you guys at the UK charity for the triple negative breast cancer put together. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
That's all right. No worries. Nats, thank you very much for being my co-host today.
Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to find out more about the charity, you can check it out. It's in the show notes. If you want to speak to us about any of our work that we do around corporate social responsibility, you can do that as well. Have a chat with Nat too. But other than that, from myself, from Natalie and from Robin, thank you very much for listening. And we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.